All right. Hello, everyone. So I have a special guest with me today, Steve. We are, or we did our first buddy read, group read, book club, whatever you want to call it, in March with Dan Jones's new novel, The Essex Dogs. We picked this wanting it to go along with Steve's book club pick, A Distant Mirror by Barbara Tuchman, and we didn't realize it didn't come out in the States until Valentine's Day, so 14 days after we started reading. So we want to apologize again for that. That was sort of a strange pick because most of you couldn't read it. However, hopefully everyone who wanted a copy was able to get a copy and either has already finished it or is close to being done. We wanted to do just a quick sort of final discussion, closing thoughts. There's a video that we did up, and it's going up on Steve's channel. It's 40 minutes, so I'll link to that one. This is going to be a lot shorter, just a bit of a cursory overview of some of our closing thoughts. So I thought, Steve, I would start just by asking you overall your opinions of this book. You read this twice. When you read it with me, it was your second time reading it.
Yeah, yeah. I went
What are your
the
thoughts?
extra mile by having the original Essex dog in the frame.
I feel very lucky that she showed up today for us.
But yeah, I this was not at all what I was expecting when I read it the first time. Not at all. I'd seen it talked about on UK booktube channels.
Mhm.
But then I got the book and I thought, okay, well, this is not the first time that I've read a novel by a working historian. Alison Weir does that. Carolee Erickson
Yep.
does that. Other people
Yep.
do that. I thought that's what I'll get. That's basically what I'll get, but that's not this book at all. It doesn't read like it was written by a historian at all. It reads like it was written by a Hollywood screenwriter
It does.
who put a little history into it. So,
Right.
and once I got used to that, I mean, the key with a book like this, I think, is that once you realize that, you don't throw it away. You know, once I got used to that, I'd say, okay, so that's what the author wants to do. Okay, well, let's see if he can do it, and he can. He very
Right.
much can. Yeah, you
Right.
mentioned that people are still reading it. I bet a lot of people are reading it much quicker than they thought they would.
I'm sure. I'm sure. I know I did. It's divided into three parts. I took basically a day for each
Yeah,
part.
you flew through it.
Yeah. And I'm a slower reader, and I read it in 3 days. And it's not a short book, not necessarily. It's a normal sized novel, but it reads very very quickly. So um, you said it didn't feel like a book written by, or it didn't feel like a novel written by a historian because of
Not to
sort of
me,
the
no, no.
simplicity of the history side of things, not
Yeah,
being
the near
super.
absence. It's almost absent. The usual hand holding that the author does. You know, I've done a million hours of research. I want you to enjoy the story I'm telling you, but first you need to know, and then they go on and on and on. That kind of hand
Right.
holding is almost completely missing
It's
from the book.
and it in some cases it works by making it more accessible to the general reading public. Of you don't have to come into this knowing the history. I'll tell you what you need to know, and really you don't need to know anything, so I won't tell you anything.
Well, you didn't know much about
I
the
didn't.
Hundred Years'
Yeah,
War,
I'm
did you?
not
When you
very
went
well
in?
versed at all in this particular time period, but you don't need to be. I read it, I enjoyed it. You don't come out of it knowing any more than you knew going into it, which is that's one of the big, I don't want to say problems I had with it. It's not really a problem because it was a choice on the part of the author. But the fact that when you're done reading it, you're going to have the same amount of knowledge that you had going in.
Pretty
So
much. Yeah.
you're not going to get a whole, if you're reading it for sort of a fictional version of historical events, but you're hoping to get some true history. It's not really meant for that. It's more, it's the time period's more used as the vehicle to then tell the story,
So
which is
did it leave you wanting to read the next book? This is the first
it
book in a
did.
trilogy. Yeah, it did.
Yeah, it did definitely leave me. It left me wanting less to learn more about the Hundred Years' War and more wanting to read the next book in the series to
I
read more
wonder what you
about
would
the
think of
characters.
other books that do this. That other books that take this kind of approach. I wonder what you'd think of them.
I'll ha-
Of other novels that take
yeah,
this kind of
after
approach.
reading Essex Dogs, which was really my one of my first of this type of novel, I want to read more because I want to see
Hmm.
I want to see if it's an isolated circumstance that I really liked this one. If I read it, if I read sort of a historical fiction novel that doesn't give a lot of history from other authors, if I would like it the same. Because with this, I went in not really knowing what to expect, so it was my first time, so I wasn't really annoyed by things not being done in a certain way. But now after having read it,
The comparison that came to my mind the first time and the second time was Bernard Cornwell, wrote a series of books called the Saxon Chronicles that is very similar, except the time passes in those novels in a way that a lot of time passes in those novels, whereas in this it doesn't yet anyway. I don't imagine that Essex Dogs Part 2. I think we're stuck with our main character, Loveday. I think he'll be the main character throughout the book, which means that we won't get the whole 100 Years' War. That's for sure. We won't get. No. We'll get some of the main action. He'll probably show up in the main action. But another series that kept coming to mind was the Viking novels of Giles Christian.
Right.
Never really caught on in this country, so you'd be hard pressed to find them in a used bookstore. But they're very similar. There's definitely an appetite for this kind of thing.
Interesting.
But who would you recommend this to?
I would certainly recommend
anybody, knowing the reading taste of your friends and family. Do you know that any of them would enjoy it?
I do, yes, and I've actually already recommended it to a lot of the people who are in my immediate circle, and I would recommend it to most readers. I think the only audience that this would not cater to is those who want a healthy dose of history along with their historical fiction. If you want a big, fat historical fiction novel that gives you the history, like Wolf Hall, something that's masterfully done, and it follows along with the history of the period and not just sort of alluding to it, this probably won't be to your taste, because you don't feel like you're in the 14th century. You don't feel like you're an observer in the 100 Years' War. It's very much 21st century dialogue, 21st century interactions. It doesn't feel authentic to the time. And even I could feel that, not knowing a lot about the period. I could feel that this probably isn't accurate, just based off of subtle things like dialogue or the way characters behaved.
I can't recommend it to anyone in my immediate circle, because there's only one person in my immediate circle, and she's illiterate.
Exactly.
She not only doesn't read books, but she doesn't
even care.
She doesn't care about them at all. No.
She doesn't even give a rip. But what would you say, Steve? Is this on your list that you would tell
she
someone?
Knows I was talking about her.
She's looking at. She's like, "What do you say about me? What you say about me?" Would you put this on a list of historical fiction you would recommend?
I would recommend it. I wouldn't call it.
You wouldn't call it historical fiction.
If somebody said, give me a list of really good historical fiction, it wouldn't even cross my mind to recommend this,
because there's no history.
But if somebody were to say to me, like, for instance, I read all sorts of things. I'm in a bit of a slump or a blah period. I need something like The Martian by Andy Weir. Gotcha. I need something that's going to grab me and simply not let me stop reading. I need that. I need to get through a book like that, where I want to miss subway stops or bus stops, where I can't wait to get back to it. I'd recommend this to them. There are people who have that. There are people who have that kind of period in their reading life, and that's all they want.
Right.
And this is a something that just really grabs you. Yeah. I would also recommend it for, I know a couple of people who have teenage boys. Teenage boys, regularly, just routinely, they fall off from reading and never pick it back up again.
Right.
And that's mostly their fault. I'm not meaning to excuse them, but sometimes it's the books they're forced to read. And this will work.
Something like this, that sort of is an instant
absolutely
grabs you by the throat.
Because they're going to recognize the Essex Dogs from all the stuff that they know. Like we were mentioning in a longer discussion, the patterns here are very familiar. I mentioned movies and also other action-oriented books, but they're also extremely familiar from video games.
Yes.
So that makes this familiar territory for even somebody who's becoming disenchanted with reading. It's still going to be immediately recognizable and really, really gripping. So, yeah, I would recommend it in that sense. I wouldn't recommend it in the same way that I would recommend, The Historian by Elizabeth Kostova, or The Illuminaries, or Ben-Hur, or something like that. I wouldn't
Right.
recommend it in that sense.
It's not on that same level.
Well, no, because you're going to go into this book and you're going to think, well, okay, what would Loveday and his men, what would they be thinking? What would be on their minds day to day as their lived reality?
Right.
And you don't ever learn that. Their lived reality is simply crude jokes and avoiding getting killed and killing other people. Right. Although a couple of our characters have a dark secret that has nothing to do with killing people. It has to do with, it's all very 21st century. It's all very contemporary.
It is.
So if you're thinking, let's just say no spoilers, but let's just thinking hypothetically, if you're thinking, well, if you have a band of brothers, a band of warriors, in a 21st century story, maybe one of them would be hiding a drug addiction. Well, it is still possible to do that even in the 14th century. And if you go into this book expecting something like that, I'm expecting that this character will be a psycho. I'm expecting that this character will die. I'm expecting that this character will seem to die, but not really die. All that's going to happen. Right. Dan Jones doesn't deviate.
There are no surprises if you know the story, or if you know that there's no surprises here.
There are no surprises, right? That pattern is often, it's in movies, and it's also mocked in movies.
Right.
What was the name of that Ben Stiller movie? Tropic Thunder?
Yes.
Perfectly captures all of this stuff. It's all there.
Right.
And it's lampooned in that movie. Well, Dan Jones is playing it straight. He's not mocking the formula. He decided to just embrace it. And it works really well for what it does. If you're looking to this book for what an ordinary guy, an ordinary man from a village in England would think going over to France to fight in the war.
Right. Or think in a contemporary sense.
Right. About spirits or women or drugs or drinking or authority or saints or the church or anything like that. Is that? No, you're not going to get
all that out. And even any depth of thought you have to cut out. Because it is what he's thinking about, what he's doing, but he doesn't. There's not a whole lot of depth in his.
Right. Essex dogs are not deep. They're not deep characters. Mm-hmm. Our main character, the main one, maybe a little, but
maybe a little compared to the others, a lot.
Yeah.
But in the sense of how deep he could have been, he's quite shallow. But it's a vehicle for the action. It's a vehicle for the overall story itself. It's not.
Yeah, that's an odd choice. I mean, Dan Jones makes it work.
He does.
But Loveday, the leader of the Essex dogs, is a little bit more reflective than the rest of them. You'd think that would have been the perfect opportunity to have him reflect about the broader issues. He in other words, would have been a fairly good vehicle for info.
Use him to educate your readers as to current events of the time, or a little bit of history as to why England is invading France.
Dan Jones steadfastly refuses to use him that way, and also goes the extra mile and doesn't even use him to inform us about the Essex dogs.
No. We don't get any background as to the reason that they are even invading France. We're not told any in-depth detail at all for the reason there, and they don't really even know. And they say that
beyond
higher, 40 shillings a month for the month.
Yeah, they know that they get money
to go burn France.
Other than that, they don't seem to really care.
Right.
But we shouldn't, you won't learn any of that, but you as a reader, once you make your peace with that, you won't miss it either.
Oh, certainly not. Once you sort of drop that expectation of I'm going to learn something about the time period through this novel, and you just say I'm just going to enjoy the story, it pulls you in, and it's a really fun read.
Yeah, and right around the scene, any scene where you're thinking, all right, well, these two characters are standing together, and they're wondering what on earth we're doing. What are we doing here on this rainy morning in France when we could be at home with our family?
Yeah,
and the scene is leading you right to the precipice of thinking, all right, well, they're going to tell me what they think about this then. And you might be thinking, the fact that they're not going to do that in this scene will be disappointing. But no, the reason they aren't going to do it in the scene, but the reason they're not going to do it in the scene is because one of them is about to get a crossbow bolt in the face.
Right.
And you're just
Right.
oh, okay,
Right.
fine.
And particularly toward the end of the book, those scenes become more and more prevalent.
Yes, we have a
Become sort of
massive battle set piece at the end of the book. Dan Jones
violent.
clearly knows the model of what he wants to write here.
Right. And he does it well. And so I think it does appeal more to the mass reader and less to a reader who wants to learn about the 100 Years' War through a fictional lens. It's not going to provide that, but it's going to provide an enjoyable reading experience of just sort of dropping into a group of guys,
right? A group
normal
of
guys.
This is every man
fighting.
Goes to war.
Yeah.
The only quibble that the more historically literate you are when you go into this book, the more of this quibble you're going to have to put aside. The only quibble is that Dan Jones's starting assumption, you know that he knows this isn't true, but his starting assumption seems to be that every man is the same in any time period.
Right.
And that absolutely is not true. And he knows that. He knows that from
but he has to base it off
his own books that he knows that. But he decides anyway that these will be 21st century guys.
Right.
21st century cosplayers.
Yeah. Again, to appeal to the readers. So you see yourself to some extent.
Yeah.
In the characters. But again, it's a conscious decision on his part. It's not a problem necessarily. Like you said, it's a quibble that could have been done differently, but they're all conscious decisions on his part. He's not accidentally doing any of this. He has the ability.
Yeah, you definitely tell. I mean,
proven that in his nonfiction.
There was a really, 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 really popular historical novel a long, long time ago that nobody's heard about anymore. Nobody reads it. It'll never be reprinted. It was called The Cloister and the Hearth. And it was full of characters, full of incident, full of info dumping. There was one character in that book who was anachronistic. There was one character in that book who did not feel at all like they lived in the same time period as the other characters. And the author of that book admitted in later interviews that was simply an oversight, that was a mistake.
Okay.
That character was supposed to feel every bit as old-timey and antique as the rest of them. It just didn't work that way.
It can be done. It can be done by error.
It can happen in error, absolutely. I would say that it happens in error in a lot of the people that Dan Jones is homaging in this book. It's tough to do. That's the point that I want to stress when we're saying this as if it were a shortcoming. But it is really tough to write a book this page turner.
Right.
It's really hard to do. He does it. There's no doubt about that. A lot of the people who are doing this read along with us are commenting on that element more than anything else. I just can't stop reading this.
Right. Which I think is probably one of the biggest points in its favor. Is it's just incredible.
Our first buddy read was a success.
It was
the unavailability of the book.
Besides the fact that it took 2 weeks for everyone else to get their copies.
We won't make that mistake again.
No, next on the docket is Shogun by James Clavell, which is 1,100 pages.
It's huge, but it's hugely popular. It's
readily available too. It's everywhere.
It's everywhere. Its basic sort of scene is, I think, less intimidating.
Interesting. Okay.
I mean, a hired soldier in a band of soldiers in an English expeditionary force in the opening years of the 100 Years' War. Before you know that Dan Jones is not going to care about any of that, you might think he's going to care about some of that, in which case it sounds really bristling. It sounds like you'd have to do preparatory reading.
Yeah, when I first started, I thought I'm going to need to just read some other book before I start this one so I can keep up. But
whereas Shogun is, a battered seagoing vessel that is literally saved from a wreck. The men on it are literally pulled out of the wreckage and wake up in a new world.
Right.
As
the reader do as well.
Yeah,
we sort of learn along with our characters.
Pedants, you'll get your know-it-alls who want to research the period of medieval Japan that we're talking about here. But the basic story is, I think, more inviting on the surface. It's a stranger in a strange land. It's
right.
the main character is very much the main character. All of his shipmates that survive are very much secondary characters. You don't really have to think about them at all. You mainly have to think about him as he learns about this new world. And that works on an intuitive level. That works much better than Essex Dogs. It's just James Clavell is not making the choices we've talked about. He wants you to know everything about the period.
Right.
And his character
went to the
much,
1100 pages.
Yeah. His character is very much of the period. Very, very much so. He's not this iceberg alone like the Essex Dogs are. So
right. So it'll provide a couple extra things that Essex Dogs did not give us. And
we want to stress to anybody who might have frozen solid like a deer in the headlights at the mention of 1100 pages. We want to stress that it's March. You were going to read a mammoth anyway.
It's March of the Mammoth, so it fits.
If you picked a mammoth, if any of you were boring enough to pick dull old George Eliot, you can change that plan and just move it to Shogun.
Absolutely.
I could barely get that out with a straight face, considering how much I love Middlemarch. But
oh man, yes,
Shogun has been sitting on a lot of people's shelves for a long time.
Absolutely.
Middlemarch will still be there.
Absolutely. It's not going anywhere. Pick up Shogun, join us.
Yeah, pick up Shogun and join us. As good as Middlemarch is, it has no beheadings.
Very
and true. You can't go 10 pages in Shogun without somebody being beheaded. So
very, very true. Thank you so much for talking, Steve. I appreciate it. I will leave a link.
Nobody watching this video was listening to either one of us. You know that.
Looking at Frida.
They were only paying attention to the beam.
For those
not appeared in a video in some time.
Oh, there she is. I'm glad she's appearing today. I feel very honored.
Yes.
For those interested, I will leave the link to the longer discussion if you don't already see it on Steve's channel. I think probably that video will go out before this one will. So I will link to the other one. But thank you so much for watching, everyone. Thank you, Steve, for chatting with me. I really appreciate it.
Join us for Shogun.
Yes, absolutely. See you all in the next video. Bye.